never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I enjoyed a good horror movie now and then, but deep down I always thought the supernatural was just superstition. That changed when I inherited my grandfather's house. The house was an old Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, a place I'd only visited a handful of times as a child. After my grandfather passed, it was left to me in his will. I had no real attachment to it. He had been a distant, brooding man with little warmth. My parents never spoke much about him, and I never asked. When I arrived to inspect the property, it felt like stepping into another era. Dust clung to every surface, and the air smelled of aged wood and forgotten memories. The floors creaked under my weight as I wandered from room to room. The furniture was draped in white sheets, like ghosts themselves. Then, I found the study. Unlike the rest of the house, the study was untouched, as if someone had been there just yesterday. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes. A massive mahogany desk sat in the center, cluttered with papers and a single oil lamp. But what caught my eye was the old photograph on the desk. It was a picture of my grandfather as a young man, standing next to another man I didn't recognize. They both looked serious, almost grim. There was something unsettling about the way they stood, stiff and formal. Behind them, barely visible, was the outline of this very house. I picked up the photograph, feeling the cool weight of it in my hands, and that's when I noticed something strange. There was something or someone standing in the background just behind the men. A shadowy figure, barely discernible, but there. My skin prickled. A sudden knock at the door made me jump. I turned, heart hammering. No one was supposed to be here. Slowly, I walked to the door, hesitating before opening it. But when I did, there was no one there. Just the empty hallway stretching into darkness. I shook my head and laughed at myself. Old house noises. That's all. But as I turned back to the study, I froze. The photograph was no longer on the desk. The room was deadly silent. The only sound was my own breathing, heavy and uneven. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow shifting along the bookshelf. Just beyond my vision, I spun around. But nothing was there. Deciding I'd had enough for one night, I locked up the study and made my way to the bedroom. Sleep did not come easily. I tossed and turned, haunted by the eerie feeling that I was not alone. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I awoke to a sound. A whisper. Faint, barely more than a breath. "Help me?" My blood ran cold. I sat up, listening. The whisper came again, drifting through the darkness like a sigh. I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the room. Nothing. Then, I saw it. The bedroom door, which I had closed before going to bed, was opened. I swallowed hard and swung my legs over the side of the bed. The air was icy against my skin as I stood, stepping cautiously into the hallway. The house was silent. But as I passed the study, I saw that the door, which I had locked, was now ajar. I pushed it open, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The room looked the same, except for one thing. The photograph was back on the desk. But now, the shadowy figure in the background was no longer just a blur. It was clear. A man, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and he was looking directly at me. Then, the whisper came again, so close it felt like it was spoken directly into my ear. "Find him." The flashlight flickered, and the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs. And then, behind me, the floor creaked. I turned, dreading what I might see. But the room was empty. For now I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The study was empty, at least it looked empty. But I could feel something there with me, a presence that made the air thick and suffocating. The whisper still echoed in my mind. Find him. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Instead, I sat in the study, staring at the photograph. The shadowy figure, no, the man, was clearer now. His hollow eyes seemed to bore into mine. Who was he? I searched through the desk, hoping for some kind of clue. Most of the papers were old business documents, yellowed and brittle with age. But then I found a small, leather-bound journal shoved into the back of a drawer. It belonged to my grandfather. I flipped through the pages, skimming his cramped handwriting. Most of it was mundane, notes about finances, meetings, the upkeep of the house. But as I neared the last few entries, the tone changed. The words became frantic. The ink smudged as if written in haste. He won't leave me alone. Every night, I hear him whispering. I see him in the mirrors, in the corners of the room. He wants justice. He wants retribution. I thought it was over. I thought burying the truth would keep him quiet. But he knows. He knows what I did. I turned the page, my fingers shaking. I should never have agreed to it. The fire was supposed to erase everything. But you cannot burn away guilt. You cannot bury a man and expect him to stay forgotten. The final entry was just 4 words, written in large, jagged letters. He is coming tonight. A cold dread crept through me. My grandfather had done something terrible. And now this spirit, this man was still here, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. I had to find out who he was. I spent the next morning researching the house, digging through old town records. And that's when I found it. A newspaper article from nearly 50 years ago. Local businessman declared missing. Foul play suspected. The man in the article was named Henry Calloway. And when I saw his photograph, my breath caught in my throat. It was him. The same man from the shadow in my grandfather's picture. I read further. Henry Calloway was last seen at my grandfather's estate. The two were business partners, but there had been rumors of a falling out. Some suspected Henry had run off with stolen money, but others believed something more sinister had happened. His body was never found. I sat back, gripping the newspaper. My grandfather's journal mentioned a fire. Could he have? A sudden bang from upstairs made me jump. I raced to the source of the noise. An attic door I hadn't even noticed before. It was wide open. The old wooden ladder unfolded. Cold air seeped from the darkness above. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back. But something wanted me to find this. Step by step, I climbed into the attic. Dust filled the air, swirling in the dim light from a small, round window. The space was filled with old trunks and forgotten belongings. And then I saw it. A section of the floor where the wooden planks didn't quite match. My pulse pounded as I knelt and pried them loose. What I found beneath them made bile rise in my throat. Bones. Human bones. I staggered back, choking on horror. Henry Calloway hadn't disappeared. He had been murdered by my grandfather. A gust of wind rushed through the attic, and with it, a voice. You found me. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath fogging in the air. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see. There, in the far corner of the attic, stood Henry Calloway. His form flickered, half-transparent. His hollow eyes filled with sorrow and rage. His skeletal fingers pointed toward the open floorboards, then to me. You must finish it, he whispered. Terror gripped me, but I understood. He wanted justice. He wanted the truth revealed. With shaking hands, I called the police. I told them I had found human remains in my attic. The investigation confirmed what I already knew. Henry Calloway had been murdered, and my grandfather had buried him beneath the house. The night after the police removed the remains, I felt the house grow lighter. The oppressive weight that had haunted me since my arrival was gone. That night, for the first time since coming here, I slept peacefully, but just before I drifted off, I thought I heard something. A whisper. Thank you, and then silence. I had always known there were secrets in my childhood home. It was an old colonial house, passed down through generations of my family. My parents never talked much about its history, but there were always strange occurrences. Whispers in empty rooms, doors creaking open on their own, the feeling of being watched. I had grown used to it, but when my parents passed away and the house became mine, I discovered something that had been hidden for decades. A forgotten room. I had been clearing out the attic when I found it. Behind a stack of old trunks, there was a section of the wall that looked off. The wood paneling was slightly different, as if it had been patched up. My pulse quickened as I ran my hands along the surface, pressing against it. My shock. The wall shifted. It wasn't a wall at all. It was a door, sealed shut. My fingers trembled as I pried it open. The air that seeped out was musty, stale, as if it had been trapped for years. Inside was a small room, barely more than a closet. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs stretched across the ceiling like veins. A single wooden chair sat in the center of the room. But what truly caught my attention was what lay on the floor, the child's doll. Its porcelain face cracked, one glassy eye missing, and beside it, scrawled on the wall in faded, childlike handwriting, were the words, "Help me." A chill ran down my spine that I backed out of the room, slamming the hidden door shut. My breathing was ragged. Who had been in there? Why was it sealed away? My parents had never mentioned anything about an extra room in the house. That night, sleep did not come easily. Every creak of the house sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the image of that little chair, the abandoned doll. Then, just past midnight, I heard it, a soft thump coming from upstairs that I lay in bed, frozen, listening. Another thump followed. Then the faintest sound of shuffling footsteps. They were coming from the attic, from inside that room. I grabbed a flashlight and forced myself to climb the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last. The attic was eerily silent when I reached it, but the door to the hidden room was slightly ajar. I knew I had closed it. I swallowed hard and pushed it open. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty chair. The doll was still on the floor, but something was different. The writing on the wall had changed. Now it read, "She's still here." I stumbled back, my breath coming in quick gasps. The air in the attic felt wrong, thick, heavy. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard it, a giggle. Faint, high-pitched, a child's laugh. I spun back around, my flashlight flickering. And in the beam of light, just for a split second, I saw her, a little girl standing in the corner. Her dress was tattered, her face pale, her hollow eyes staring straight at me. Then the flashlight went out. The room plunged into darkness, and in that suffocating blackness, I heard her whisper, "Don't leave me." I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my bedroom. The door locked, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. But even then, I could still hear her soft knocks against the attic floor. A faint giggle outside my door, and a whisper in my ear as I drifted into restless sleep. "You found me." I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. The little girl standing in the attic, her pale face watching me from the darkness. And that whisper, "You found me." By morning, I had convinced myself that it had been my imagination. Sleep deprivation, stress, anything but what it truly was. But deep down, I knew the truth. That room had been sealed away for a reason. And I had let something out. I needed answers. I spent the day digging through old documents, trying to find anything about the history of the house. My parents had kept boxes of records, yellowed newspapers, and brittle letters in the basement. Hours passed before I finally found something. A newspaper clipping from 1947. Local girl missing, presumed dead. The article told the story of Margaret Bellamy, an 8-year-old girl who had gone missing while staying at my house. She had been the niece of the previous owners, sent to live with them after her parents died in an accident. One day, she simply vanished. The family insisted she had run away, but neighbors whispered that something more sinister had happened. The police searched for weeks but found nothing. Margaret Bellamy was never seen again. I stared at the old, grainy photo of her. The same hollow eyes, the same faded dress, the same little girl I had seen in the attic. My hands trembled as I set the paper down. Margaret hadn't run away. She had died in this house. And she was still here. That night, I locked my bedroom door. I wasn't taking any chances. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt it again. That suffocating heaviness in the air. Then came the knocking, soft, rhythmic. Tap, tap. Tap. It was coming from inside the walls. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to stop. But then, something even worse. A rustling sound. Like fabric sliding against the floor. She's in the room. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to look, but something inside me, some awful, morbid curiosity, forced my eyes open. And there she was, standing at the foot of my bed. Her dark, hollow eyes bore into mine, her tiny hands clutching the cracked porcelain doll. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a breath, she whispered, "They left me here." I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the headboard. What do you want?" Her head tilted, eyes glistening. "They locked me away." The realization hit me like ice water. Margaret hadn't just died in this house. She had been trapped in that room. Sealed away. Murdered. I forced myself to speak. "Who did this to you?" For the first time, something like fear crossed her face. Her lips trembled as she raised one shaking hand and pointed toward the bedroom door. A loud bang shattered the silence. The door rattled in its frame as if something was pounding against it. The air turned freezing, my breath coming in visible puffs. Margaret's voice was urgent now, pleading. "They're coming." The banging grew louder. The walls shook. The lights flickered, and then silence. The doorknob twisted slowly. The door creaked open. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then I saw them. Figures. Dark, looming shadows spilling into the room. Their shapes twisted unnaturally. Their faces blurred, featureless. And yet, I felt them staring at me. Margaret whimpered, clutching my arm. "They don't want me to leave." The shadows surged forward. I grabbed Margaret's hand. "Run!" We tore through the house, down the stairs, the walls groaning around us. The front door wouldn't budge. I yanked at the handle, my palms slick with sweat. The shadows were right behind us, reaching. Then Margaret's voice rang out, stronger than before. "No." A force like a sudden gust of wind burst through the house. The shadows reeled back, shrieking. The walls trembled. The entire house screamed. And then, silence. I gasped for air, my heart slamming against my ribs. The shadows were gone. I turned to Margaret. She stood in the foyer, her small figure bathed in pale moonlight. She looked different, lighter, more whole. She smiled at me. "Thank you." And then, just like that, she faded away. By morning, the house felt different. The air was clear, the heaviness gone. I knew, deep down, that Margaret was finally at peace. I sealed the hidden room again. Not to trap anything inside, but to let it rest. The past had finally been put to rest. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint sound of a child's laughter, and I like to believe that somewhere, Margaret is finally free. The night my brother disappeared, the fog was so thick I could barely see past my own hands. It rolled in without warning, swallowing the trees and the old dirt road in a ghostly haze. Our house sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods, and when the fog came, it felt like the world beyond our doorstep no longer existed. I was 15 when it happened. My brother, Daniel, was 8. I remember the last thing he said to me. I saw him again. I frowned, looking up from my book. Saw who? The man in the fog. A cold prickle ran down my spine. Daniel had been talking about him for weeks. He claimed there was a man who stood at the edge of the woods, just beyond our backyard, watching. My parents dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination. I wanted to believe that too, but there was something about the way Daniel said it. His voice hushed, his wide eyes darting toward the window, that unsettled me. "You're imagining things?" I muttered, flipping a page. But Daniel just shook his head. That night, I woke to a strange sound. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap against my window. I sat up, heart hammering. My bedroom overlooked the backyard. The fog had thickened, swirling like smoke under the moonlight. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the tree line, tall, motionless, watching. A deep, primal fear coiled in my gut. I couldn't make out his face, just the shape of a man, half hidden by the mist. I scrambled out of bed and ran to Daniel's room. He wasn't there. The sheets were thrown aside. His window was open. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the thick scent of damp earth. I leaned out, my stomach twisting. Small footprints in the dewy grass led toward the woods. Toward him. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The fog closed around me like a living thing. "Daniel!" I shouted, my voice swallowed by the thick air. Silence. Then, somewhere ahead, I heard a faint giggle. "Daniel!" That I ran faster, the flashlight beam cutting through the fog. The trees loomed around me, their twisted branches clawing at the night sky. My pulse pounded in my ears. And then, I saw him. The man. Standing just a few feet away. The fog clung to him like a second skin. His body was wrong, too tall, too thin. His head tilted slightly, as if studying me. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. Then, he raised one long, bony hand, and pointed behind him. In the mist, I saw the faint outline of my brother. His small figure stood motionless, barely visible through the swirling fog. "Daniel!" I took a step forward. The man shook his head slowly, and then, he smiled, a horrible, jagged grin that stretched impossibly wide. The fog thickened, swallowing them both, and just like that, Daniel was gone. I don't remember running back to the house. I don't remember slamming the door shut, locking it behind me, my hands trembling so hard I could barely turn the key. All I remember is the silence. The awful, suffocating silence that filled the house once Daniel was gone, and why parents called the police. They searched the woods for days, but they never found him.
No footprints.
No signs of struggle. No body. It was as if he had never been there at all. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen. The man in the fog had taken him. The years passed, but the memory never faded. The house felt emptier without Daniel. My parents drifted further apart, their grief like a chasm between them. Eventually, they sold the house and moved away. But I could never leave it behind. I needed to know the truth. I spent years researching disappearances in the area. Daniel wasn't the first child to vanish near those woods. Every few decades, another one would go missing under eerily similar circumstances, always on a foggy night. Always without a trace. I tracked down old records, local legends, anything I could find. And eventually, I came across something that made my blood run cold, an old journal. Written by a man who had lived in our town in the late 1800s. There is something in the fog. It watches. It waits. And when the time is right, it takes. The more I read, the more I understood. The man in the fog wasn't human. He never had been. He was something else. Something old. Something hungry. And he had taken Daniel. I returned to the house on the anniversary of his disappearance. It was abandoned now, the windows boarded up, the roof sagging from years of neglect. The forest had reclaimed most of the backyard, thick roots creeping over the broken fence. The fog had already started rolling in by the time I stepped inside. I didn't hesitate. I made my way to Daniel's old room, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The window was still there, cracked and weathered, just as he had left it, and outside. The man was waiting, standing at the edge of the trees, exactly as he had that night. My breath came in shallow gasps. But I forced myself to step forward, out into the yard. "I know what you are," I said, my voice shaking. "I know what you took from me." He didn't move, didn't speak. But I saw something shift in the fog behind him. A shadow. Small. A child, Daniel. His face was pale, his eyes distant, as if he were only half there. "Daniel!" I reached out, but the man in the fog took a step closer, his form twisting unnaturally. The air around me grew thick, heavy. My skin prickled with icy dread. He wanted me to come closer. I gritted my teeth. "You can't have him." For the first time, the man tilted his head. The jagged smile stretched across his face, impossibly wide. Then, he raised one skeletal hand and pointed at me. Pain exploded in my skull. I saw flashes of faces. Children, lost and forgotten, swallowed by the fog. I felt their fear, their confusion, their hopelessness. But I also saw something else. A way out. I stumbled forward, pushing past the pain, past the suffocating cold. The man in the fog reached for me, but I didn't stop. I grabbed Daniel's wrist. For a moment, nothing happened, and then, a scream. Not from Daniel, not from me, from him. The fog shuddered, writhing like a living thing. The man in the fog let out an inhuman wail, his form flickering, unraveling. The mist thinned. The trees reappeared, And then, he was gone. Daniel collapsed into my arms, his body warm, solid, real. His small hands clutched my shirt, his voice barely a whisper. You found me. Tears burned down my face as I held him. I had him back. After all these years, I had my brother back. The fog never returned after that night, and neither did the man. I never should have taken that job. It was supposed to be temporary, just a few months working the night shift at the old Rosehill Motel on the outskirts of town. The place was nearly abandoned, with only a handful of guests passing through each week. The pay was terrible, the hours long, but I needed the money. The manager, Mr. Leland, was an odd man. He never spoke much, just gave me the keys, told me to check in guests, and most importantly, never rent out room 6. That was his only rule. I thought he was just superstitious. Maybe there had been an accident there, or maybe it was just in bad shape. Either way, I didn't ask questions. First, the job was easy. The guests who did show up barely spoke. Exhausted travelers looking for a cheap place to sleep before moving on. The nights dragged on, the silence broken only by the buzzing of the neon vacancy sign outside. But then came the storm. It was past midnight when the rain started, pounding against the motel windows in thick sheets. Thunder rumbled in the distance as I sat at the front desk, flipping through an old magazine. That's when the man arrived. He was soaked to the bone, his hood pulled low over his face. He leaned on the counter, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Need a room, he muttered. I grabbed the key for room 4, but he shook his head. No. Room 6. My stomach tightened. I can't rent that one out. The man's hands gripped the counter. His knuckles were pale. Please. Something about the way he said it, so desperate, so urgent, made my skin crawl. I'm sorry, I said. Motel policy. His head lowered, and for a second I thought he might argue. But then, without another word, he turned and walked back into the rain. I watched him go, my pulse still racing. He didn't even have a car. And then, the phone rang. I jumped, fumbling for the receiver. Hello. First, nothing but static. Then, beneath the crackling noise, a whisper. He's still in there. The line went dead. I stared at the receiver, my hands shaking. The motel phone rarely rang, and even when it did, it was just travelers looking for a room. But this? I forced myself to breathe. Just a prank. That's what I told myself. Then, from down the hall, a door creaked open. Slow. Deliberate. Room 6. The door that was supposed to stay locked. The air in the lobby turned ice cold. My breath came out in visible puffs as I grabbed the keys and stepped into the hallway. The door to room 6 was wide open. Inside, the room was dark, untouched. The bed was made, the air stale with disuse. The only thing that stood out was the mirror. A massive, antique mirror covered almost the entire far wall. The glass was foggy, the edges blackened with age. And then, a movement. Not mine. Something inside the mirror shifted. My reflection stood still. But the other me smiled. Not a normal smile. Not mine. Its lips stretched too wide. Its eyes darkened, hollow pits of shadow. I staggered back, my heart hammering. Then, the lights flickered. The air in the room shifted, a pressure pressing against my skull. And from the depths of the mirror, a whisper slithered through the air. He's still in here. The door slammed shut behind me, and in the mirror, something stepped forward. The door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. I spun around, fumbling for the knob. It wouldn't budge. The air in the room was thick, heavy, like something unseen was pressing against my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I turned back to the mirror, my stomach twisting with dread. The reflection was wrong. The room in the glass was darker, the corners swallowed in shadows. And my reflection, it was grinning, not just a normal grin. Its lips stretched too wide, the skin around its mouth splitting like cracked porcelain. Its eyes were sunken pits of darkness, empty and hungry. Then it moved, not like a reflection should. I stepped forward. I stumbled back, pressing against the door. My reflection stayed in place, but the other me inside the mirror kept coming. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, distorted, like a puppet with its strings tangled. And then it spoke. He never left. The voice was mine, but twisted, warped, layered with something deeper, something wrong. I reached for my phone, my fingers shaking, but the screen was dead. The air in the room was freezing now, my breath coming in visible puffs. The thing inside the mirror lurched forward, pressing its hands against the glass. The surface rippled like water. Something inside me screamed to move, but my body wouldn't listen. My limbs felt heavy, numb, and then it reached through. A pale, withered hand breached the glass, fingers curling, nails cracked and blackened. I finally found my voice. I screamed. The hand grasped my wrist, ice cold and impossibly strong. A force yanked me toward the mirror, my feet skidding across the floor. The glass wasn't solid anymore. It was liquid, a swirling, endless void. I could see the room inside, the other room. The other me stood just beyond, grinning, waiting. Your turn. The whisper slithered through the air as the hand pulled me in. My head hit the floor as I crashed into the other side. The room was different. The walls were darker, the air suffocating. The bed was gone. The door, nothing but a solid, blank wall. I turned, my heart slamming against my ribs. The mirror was still there, but on this side it was no longer foggy. I could see through it. And on the other side, I saw him, the real me, still standing in room 6, looking at me, smiling. He lifted his hand, giving me a slow, mocking wave. I pounded against the glass. Let me out. But the other me just shook his head. Then he turned. He walked to the door, my door, and opened it, stepping out, leaving me trapped. I screamed, slamming my fists against the glass, but no sound came. The mirror had sealed. And then, the lights in the room flickered. A whisper crawled through the darkness behind me. He never left. I turned, and something was waiting. Something that had been trapped here for a very, very long time. The last person who had taken this room. The last person who had lost. The last reflection. The lights went out. And the real me? He walked out of room 6, whistling softly, stepping into my life, while I stayed behind, waiting for the next guest, for the next reflection, for the next turn. When I inherited my aunt's house, I thought it would be a fresh start. After years of struggling in the city, the idea of escaping to a quiet, secluded home in the countryside seemed like a blessing. It wasn't fancy, just an old Victorian house nestled at the end of a long, winding road, surrounded by dense woods. But it was mine, or so I thought. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Even in the middle of the day, there were no birds, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of life. Just a heavy, oppressive quiet that clung to the house like a fog. The second thing I noticed was the whispering. Started my first night there. I was lying in bed, exhausted from the move, when I heard it, soft, barely more than a breath. Help me. I shot up, my heart pounding. The room was dark, the wind rattling the old windows. I told myself it was just the house settling, just my imagination. But deep down I knew better. The whispers didn't stop. Every night they came. Soft, urgent, closer. Please help me. By the third night I barely slept. The whispering seemed to move through the walls, drifting from room to room. The air in the house felt wrong, thick, suffocating. I started searching. I tore through old faded photographs, anything that could tell me more about my aunt and this house. But there was nothing, just dusty memories, fragments of a life that no longer existed. Then I found the journal. It was buried at the back of a closet, tucked inside a locked drawer of an old dresser. My aunt's handwriting was jagged, hurried, and the things she wrote made my blood run cold. The whispering started after I moved in. At first I thought it was the wind, but it isn't. It's coming from inside the walls. I should have left. I should have burned this place down. But now it's too late. It knows I can hear it. I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking. And that's when the whisper came again. Right behind me. I know you can hear me. The lights flickered. The room grew colder. And then, a knock. From inside the wall. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. Something was inside the walls. And it wanted out. I ran, grabbing my phone, dialing the only person who might know what to do. Mr. Halloway, the man who had handled my aunt's estate. He answered on the second ring. You shouldn't be there, he said immediately. His voice was tight, urgent. Get out. Now. What's in the house? I demanded. A long silence. Then, you don't understand. The house isn't haunted. I swallowed hard. Then what is it? Another pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, the house is hungry. The line went dead. And behind me, the wall cracked open. A gaping, splintered hole yawned wide, revealing something inside. Something that had been waiting. And then, the lights went out. The darkness was absolute. I staggered backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air inside the house had changed. It was thick now, pressing in around me like invisible hands. The walls creaked, groaned, breathed. And from the gaping hole in the wall, something moved. A whisper slithered through the blackness. Don't leave me. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers slick with sweat. The screen flickered on, casting a weak glow around the room. The hole in the wall was wider now. Inside there was something, a shape, human. A face stared back at me, half buried in the rotting wood, its mouth frozen in a soundless scream. Its eyes were still moving. I choked back a scream and stumbled away, my shaking hands dialing Mr. Halloway again. He picked up immediately. You're still inside? He hissed. I told you to leave. There's something, in the wall. I gasped. I saw a face. It spoke to me. Mr. Halloway's silence was worse than his words. You need to listen to me, he said. That house, it's not just a house. It feeds. My voice cracked. On what? Another pause. Then, on the people who live there. A chill coiled around my spine. I turned back toward the wall, the phone trembling in my hand. The face was still there, its expression changing. The mouth moved, its lips forming silent words. A whisper followed. Please, help me. And I suddenly knew. My aunt wasn't the first. There had been others. I don't understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. What is this place? Mr. Halloway exhaled shakily. It was never a home. It was built for a purpose, a trap, a prison. A prison for what? For them. Before I could ask what he meant, the call cut off. The whispering returned, growing louder. The walls shuddered. And then, a hand shot out from the hole. Pale, skeletal fingers grasped the air, reaching for me. I screamed, stumbling backward, but the hand didn't attack. It trembled violently, the fingers clawing at the air as if desperate to escape. Then I saw it. There were more hands. Dozens. Some were new, flesh still clinging to the bones. Others were rotting, skeletal, fused into the wood. All trapped. All trying to get out. A sick realization hit me. The house was alive. And it had been feeding on them. The whispering turned into pleading. Help us, please. I had to get out. I turned, bolting for the front door. The floor buckled beneath me, groaning like a wounded animal. The hallway stretched impossibly long, the shadows moving. Then the whispering changed, no longer pleading. Now, angry. You can't leave. The walls caved inward, the floor split apart. A force slammed into me, sending me sprawling to the ground. My vision blurred, pain flaring through my ribs. I tried to crawl, but something wrapped around my ankle. A hand. No, a dozen hands. They were dragging me back. I screamed, kicking wildly, my nails clawing at the floor. The wood beneath my fingertips rotted, softened, became flesh. The house was swallowing me. I was gonna end up like them, buried. Forgotten. Another whisper in the walls.
No, Igaspat. No.
With everything I had left, I reached for the fireplace poker near the old hearth. My fingers closed around the cold iron, and I swung. The metal pierced the floor, and the house screamed. Not a creak, not a groan, a scream. The walls shook, the hands recoiling as if burned. A deep, furious whisper filled the air, but I wasn't listening. I staggered to my feet and ran. The front door loomed ahead, but the house wasn't done with me yet. The floor lurched, throwing me sideways. A shadow rose up from the wall. A shape, massive and writhing, forming into something that barely resembled a human. It had no face, just a gaping, hungry mouth. I lunged for the door. The shadow reached for me. I threw myself through the opening just as the house collapsed inward. The last thing I heard was the screams of the trapped souls. Their voices swallowed as the walls folded into themselves, sealing them inside forever. And then, silence. The house was gone. Not destroyed, gone. As if it had never been there at all. I lay in the dirt, gasping, shaking. The forest around me was silent again. But this time it felt different, lighter, like the house's presence had poisoned the land. And now, it was finally gone. Or so I thought. I never went back to that place. I sold the land to a developer, moved as far away as I could. I told myself it was over. But some nights, when the air is too still, when the wind doesn't blow, I hear them, the whispers, still calling, still waiting, for someone else to listen, for someone else to take the house, for someone else to feed it.